Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're heading way back in time to ancient China.
It's a civilization that so many people are fascinated by, and it's not hard to see why.
Not at all. And you, our listeners, have sent in a ton of great questions for this deep dive, which makes it even more fun for us to jump in.
Absolutely.
So let's start with some of the oldest stuff that's been found in, archaeology and artifacts and all that. You asked about this colorful pottery, painted pottery, I guess you could call it, found along the Yellow River.
Ah, yes, the hitch.
Yeah.
Tao. It's really beautiful stuff and dates back to like 5,000 to 4,000 BCE, so pretty early on in ancient Chinese civilization.
Wow, so really far back. So what can these pots tell us about the people who made them?
Well, for starters, it seems like they were a pretty creative bunch. I mean, these pots weren't just functional. They were decorated with all sorts of intricate patterns.
I've seen pictures, and they really are striking lots of geometric shapes, animals, human figures.
Exactly. So they give us a glimpse into the artistic skills of these early farming communities.
And maybe even their beliefs and rituals.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some scholars think that the patterns and symbols might represent things they valued or maybe stories from their mythology.
Oh, interesting. It's like a window into their worldview.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got painted pottery, but you also asked about another type of pottery, black pottery, or hik, found in the same region, but a bit later on, right?
Right. We see black pottery emerging around 2000 to 1500 BCE. It's very different stylistically.
Yeah, when you see them side by side, the difference is obvious. It's much simpler, more elegant, maybe.
Yeah, I think elegant is a good word for it. It has this smooth, polished surface, almost like, well, I don't want to say modern, but
I know what you mean. It's got a really timeless quality.
totally. And it tells us that they were experimenting with different techniques, like maybe higher firing temperatures to achieve that black color.
Or it could just be a shift in aesthetics.
Right, could be. Like they were going for a more minimalist vibe.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about pottery, but now let's move on to the big one, dynasties. Okay, let's do it.
You specifically asked about the very first confirmed dynasty in China, which would be the Shang dynasty, right?
The Shang dynasty. Yeah, they emerged around the 16th century BCE in the lower Yellow River Valley.
And we actually have archaeological evidence to support this, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely. And this evidence isn't just pottery shards. We found their cities, royal tombs, bronze artifacts.
And of course, those famous oracle bones.
Oracle bones. Yeah, they're kind of like ancient fortune cookies, but a lot more serious.
Okay, so you specifically asked about the inscriptions on these oracle bones. What exactly are they, and what do they tell us?
So imagine you're the Shang King, and you need some divine guidance. Maybe you're about to go to war, or there's a drought, or you're just having a bad day. You call in your diviners, who are like, I don't know, a combination of priests and scientists.
Interesting combo.
Right. They take these bones or turtle shells, and they inscribe them with questions. Will we win the battle? Will the rains come?
And then they apply heat to these bones, which causes them to crack. And they interpret these cracks as messages from the spirits or ancestors or whoever they thought they were talking to.
Wow. So it's a combination of spirituality and I guess you could call it a form of divination, right?
Absolutely. And these inscriptions are also the earliest known examples of Chinese writing.
That's incredible to think about. So we can actually trace the evolution of the Chinese language all the way back to these oracle bones.
Pretty amazing.
Totally amazing. So the Shang dynasty, clearly they were a big deal. But like all dynasties, their time and power eventually came to an end. And you asked about the state that took over around the 11th century BCE in northern China, the Zhou dynasty. And they had this really interesting concept of legitimacy.
The mandate of heaven. Yeah, it was a game changer in terms of how they justified their rule.
So tell us more about this mandate of heaven. How did it work?
Well, basically it said that a ruler's right to rule came from heaven itself.
So not from military might or inheritance?
Not just that, no. It was more about being a morally just and effective leader. The idea was that if a king was righteous and ruled wisely, heaven would grant him prosperity and stability for his people.
Makes sense. So what happens if a king isn't so righteous?
Well, if he became corrupt, incompetent, or lost the support of the people, heaven would withdraw its mandate and he could be overthrown. It almost sounds like a divine performance review.
High stakes. No wonder the Zhou kings tried to keep their noses clean. So they didn't just rely on the mandate of heaven, right? They also had a specific system of governing this huge territory.
You're talking about the fengji,
Yeah.
often translated as feudalism, but it had its own distinct Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, and I think the word feudalism can be a bit misleading because it conjures up images of knights and castles.
Definitely. In the Chinese context, it was more about a network of loyalties and obligations.
Okay, so explain how it worked. Who was in charge of what?
So at the top, you have the king, who grants land to his nobles in exchange for their loyalty, military service, and taxes.
Sort of like a contract.
Exactly. And these nobles, in turn, grant portions of their land to lesser lords and so on.
So it created this whole hierarchy of power relationships.
Right. It was meant to be a stable system, but as we know, power dynamics can be unpredictable.
And speaking of unpredictable, you asked about a major event that happened in the 8th century BCE, the sacking of the Zhou capital, Haojing.
It was a major turning point. The Zhou capital, sacked by invaders, imagine that the heart of the empire breached.
That must have been a huge blow to their authority.
Absolutely. It sent a message that they weren't invincible, that the mandate of heaven could be revoked.
So what happened next? Did the Zhou dynasty just collapse?
Not right away. They were forced to flee eastward and establish a new capital, but this event marked a decline in their power. It's what historians call the beginning of the Spring and Autumn period.
Okay, the Spring and Autumn period, you specifically wanted to know when this period took place. And, well, it lasted from 771 to 476 BCE.
And it gets its name from a famous chronicle, the Spring and Autumn Annals.
Which, according to tradition, was at least edited by a certain someone we've all heard of, Confucius.
Confucius, he's kind of a big deal. And yeah, it's thought that he either compiled or edited the Spring and Autumn Annals.
Talk about having an impact on history. And speaking of Confucius, you asked specifically about his role in this chaotic period of Chinese history.
Confucius, or Ingrucius, was born into this chaotic time. He wasn't just a philosopher, though. He was like a social reformer, I guess you could say.
So he wasn't just sitting in an ivory tower pondering the meaning of life.
No, he was out there trying to make a difference. He really believed that society could be improved through moral cultivation. He wanted to restore order, harmony, and virtue.
And how did he propose to do that?
Well, one of his key concepts was ritual, or keric. But it wasn't just about empty ceremonies or following rules for the sake of it.
So it's more than just bowing and scraping.
Yeah, it was more about how you conduct yourself in every aspect of life. Like, every action, from the smallest gesture to the most formal ceremony, could be an expression of your inner virtue.
So being mindful of your actions, essentially.
Exactly. It was about creating a society where everyone strives to be their best selves, both individually and in their relationships with others.
Okay, I can see how that's relevant even today. We could all use a little more mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
But what about this other big Confucian idea, benevolence, or Ren? What was that all about?
Benevolence, or Ren, it's a powerful concept. Think about it. It's about treating everyone with kindness, empathy, and respect, recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every human being.
So it's about more than just being polite. It's about really seeing the humanity in others.
Exactly. And Confucius saw this as the foundation of a truly just and moral society.
Okay, I'm starting to see why his teachings have resonated for so many centuries. But of course, Confucius wasn't the only voice in ancient China. You asked about the era that followed the Spring and Autumn period, a time of even greater upheaval, the Warring States period.
The Warring States period, or Zhangguo Shidai, lasted from 475 to 221 BCE. And yeah, it was intense.
I mean, the name pretty much says it all right. Warring States.
No kidding. It was a time of constant conflict and rivalry between different states, all vying for power and dominance.
Sounds exhausting. And in the midst of all this chaos, what was happening on the philosophical front?
Well, it was actually kind of a golden age for philosophy. This is when the 100 schools of thought really flourished.
100 schools of thought. So like a philosophical free-for-all.
Exactly. Think of it like a giant brainstorming session with all these different thinkers and schools of thought coming up with their own answers to the big questions.
So like, what is the best way to live? How should society be organized?
Exactly. And one of these schools of thought was very much in line with Confucius's ideas about human nature. You asked about the philosopher who believed in the inherent goodness of people that would be Mencius.
Mencius, or Medley. He's considered one of the most important Confucian thinkers after Confucius himself.
Absolutely. Mencius took Confucius's teachings and kind of expanded on them. He had this really optimistic view of human nature.
Okay, tell us more. How did he see humans as inherently good?
He believed that we are all born with a natural inclination toward goodness. Like if you look at a baby, you see this pure potential, this innate capacity for compassion and empathy.
Oh, I love that.
Right. And Mencius believed that it's society's role to nurture these good qualities to help us develop into virtuous human beings.
Okay, I see how that fits with Confucius's emphasis on education and moral cultivation. But didn't someone disagree with this view?
Oh, yeah. Big time. And you asked about the guy who believed the opposite, that human nature is inherently bad. That would be Sunzi or Zunzi.
So Sunzi takes a much darker view of humanity.
He does. He believed that we are born selfish and driven by our desires. And if left unchecked, these desires will lead to chaos and conflict.
Okay, so I can see how that might lead to a very different approach to governing.
Yeah.
If you believe that people are basically bad, you're going to need a lot more rules and punishments.
Exactly. And Nonzi believed that it's society's job to shape us into moral beings through strict rules, rituals, and education. He saw it as kind of a molding process, like...
Shaping clay.
Exactly. You need to mold the clay to create something beautiful and functional.
Wow, so two very different takes on human nature. It makes you think about how our beliefs about who we are fundamentally shape our worldview.
Totally. And speaking of different worldviews, you asked about a philosopher who really went against the grain, who challenged those deeply ingrained Confucian ideas about hierarchy and ritual. That was Mozi, or the founder of Mohism.
Mozi. He's not as famous as Confucius or Mencius, but he had some really radical ideas, right?
Radical is a good word. He advocated for universal love, or
Universal love, so like love everyone equally.
Pretty much. He believed that we should extend love and compassion to everyone, regardless of their social status, family ties, or even nationality. It was a very radical idea, especially in a society that was so hierarchical.
Yeah, it almost sounds modern. Like we're still struggling with that idea today.
Totally. And Mozi didn't stop there. He also criticized the extravagance of rituals and funerals, which were a big deal in Confucianism.
He was kind of minimalist, wasn't he?
Yeah, you could say that. He believed that all those elaborate ceremonies were a waste of resources and that we should focus on helping the living, especially the poor and vulnerable.
Practical and compassionate. I like it. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. You asked about two philosophers who developed a school of thought that emphasized harmony with nature, living in accordance with the natural flow of the universe. I'm sensing some Taoism coming on.
You got it. Laozi, or Jasner, and Zhuangzi, or Sunna, are considered the founders of Taoism. Their teachings, captured in texts like the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, offer a really unique perspective on life, the universe, and everything.
I've always been intrigued by Taoism, but it can be a bit hard to wrap your head around. What are some of the key concepts?
Well, one of the most important concepts is Wu Wei, or Wu Wei, which is often translated as non-action or effortless action.
Non-action. Doesn't sound very productive.
It's not about being passive, though. It's more about aligning yourself with the natural flow of things, acting without striving or resisting.
Okay, so it's more like going with the flow.
Exactly. Imagine a river flowing effortlessly around obstacles, finding its path naturally. That's kind of the Taoist ideal.
I love that image. Okay, one last school of thought before we move on. You asked about legalism, and one of its key proponents, Shang Yang. And legalism, it's kind of the opposite of Taoism, right?
Totally different vibe. Legalism is all about order, control, and a strong state with clear laws and swift punishments.
Sounds a bit intense.
No.
What were their core beliefs?
Well, they believed that human nature is fundamentally selfish and that people need a strong ruler and a system of strict laws to keep them in check.
So no room for Wu Wei in legalism.
Definitely not. They were all about practicality, efficiency, and maintaining order through any means necessary.
And this philosophy, this legalism, it actually had a huge impact on the dynasty that ultimately unified China. But that's a story for part 2 of this deep dive.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient China. Last time we left off with all those different philosophies battling it out during the Warring States period. But eventually one state and one philosophy emerged victorious.
Yeah, you asked about the dynasty that finally managed to unify this vast and fractured land. And it's the one that gives us the Terracotta Army and, well, the name China itself.
The Qin dynasty. A short but intense period in Chinese history.
And they embrace legalism, that philosophy we were just talking about, right?
Yeah.
The one that emphasizes order, control, and a strong central authority.
Exactly. It fit perfectly with their goal of unifying and controlling a vast empire. And speaking of control, you specifically asked about the ruler who orchestrated this unification, the first emperor himself, Qin Shi Huang.
Qin Shi Huang. The name kind of says it all, doesn't it? First emperor. It's like he was destined to make his mark on history.
He definitely wasn't lacking in ambition. He really saw himself as the beginning of a new era, sweeping away the chaos of the Warring States period and creating a unified, centralized empire.
And he didn't waste any time in putting a stamp on things.
Yeah.
You asked about one of his most ambitious projects, a project that's become an iconic symbol of China, the Great Wall.
The Great Wall. Yeah, the one, Shancheng. It's hard to even grasp the scale of it. I mean, it stretches for thousands of miles, a massive dragon of stone and earth snaking across the landscape.
It's almost unimaginable, the amount of labor and resources that must have gone into building it.
It was a truly monumental undertaking, and it really speaks to Qin Shi Huang's determination to protect his empire from those nomadic invaders to the north.
It's a testament to his vision, but also, I think, a reminder of the human cost of such ambitious projects.
Definitely. But the Great Wall wasn't his only legacy. He also implemented a whole range of reforms aimed at standardizing and centralizing the empire.
Right. You wanted to know about those other changes he made.
Well, Qin Shi Huang was all about creating uniformity and efficiency. He standardized weights and measures, so a pound of rice would mean the same thing in every corner of the empire.
Smart move. I can only imagine the chaos if every region had its own system.
Totally. He also standardized the writing system, which helped facilitate communication and administration across such a vast territory.
Makes sense. A unified script for a unified empire.
Exactly. And he introduced a single currency, which boosted trade and economic integration. It's amazing to think about how much he accomplished in such a short period of time.
He was a man in a hurry to transform his empire. But his reforms weren't always so. Well, you asked about a policy that's pretty chilling, the burning of books and burying of scholars.
Yeah, the Fenshu Kongru. It's definitely a dark side to Qin Shi Huang's reign.
I mean, it sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, literally burning books to control information. What was he thinking?
It seems he saw Confucian scholars, with their emphasis on tradition and questioning authority, as a threat to his power and his vision for a unified state.
So he decided to silence them, permanently.
Sadly, yes. It's a stark reminder that even the most progressive leaders can be capable of terrible acts.
Okay, let's move on to something a bit less disturbing. You asked about the actual structure of Qin Shi Huang's government. How did he administer this vast, newly unified empire?
He implemented a system known as the commandery system, or Zunxianzi, which was a masterpiece of centralized control. He divided the empire into 36 commanderies, each ruled by officials appointed directly by him.
So he took power away from the regional lords and concentrated it in his own hands.
Exactly. It was a way to eliminate those potential rivals who had caused so much trouble during the Warring States period. And it created a more efficient, streamlined system of government.
But as we know, even the most powerful empires don't last forever. You wanted to know what happened next? And, well, the Qin dynasty didn't exactly have a long run.
It's a classic case of easy come, easy go. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, and the dynasty quickly unraveled.
All that power, and it just slipped away.
Pretty much. Rebellions erupted throughout the empire, and within a few years, a new dynasty emerged from the chaos, the Han dynasty.
And the Han dynasty, they're the ones who gave us that beautiful capital city, Chang'an, right?
You got it. Chang'an, meaning eternal peace, was a fitting name for a dynasty that emerged from such a turbulent period. It was a magnificent city, strategically located and designed to showcase the Han dynasty's power and sophistication.
A symbol of a new era. But how did they actually rule this vast empire? You were curious about their governing system.
The Han were clever. They combined elements of the Qin dynasty's centralized commandery system with aspects of the older Zhou dynasty's feudal system, creating a hybrid system. It was a delicate balancing act, trying to maintain central control while also accommodating powerful regional interests.
It sounds complicated, but it clearly worked because the Han dynasty lasted for centuries.
It did. They were a pretty successful dynasty known for their relative stability and cultural achievements. And they weren't afraid to look beyond their borders. You asked about a guy named Zhang Qin, who was sent on a westward expedition.
Ah, yeah, Zhang. He was like the ancient Chinese version of Marco Polo, right?
Exactly. In 139 BCE, Emperor Wu of Han sent him on a mission to forge alliances with groups to the west, specifically the Yuezhi people.
Why the Yuezhi? What was so special about them?
Well, the Han were constantly being harassed by the Xiongnu, those nomadic warriors who controlled the trade routes to the west.
Right, the Silk Road.
Exactly. The Han hoped that by forging an alliance with the Yuezhi, they could outmaneuver the Xiongnu and secure those valuable trade routes.
So it was a geopolitical chess game, essentially.
Pretty much. And Zhang Qin's journey was epic. He was captured by the Xiongnu and held captive for over a decade.
Talk about a setback.
He eventually escaped, though, and continued on his mission. While he didn't manage to secure the alliance they were hoping for, he did return with a wealth of knowledge about Central Asia, its people, its cultures, and its trade potential.
So an accidental discovery that ended up having a huge impact on China's connection to the wider world.
Exactly. His expeditions helped to open up the Silk Road, which would transform China's economy and culture for centuries to come. But let's shift gears a bit and talk economics. You asked about the Han Dynasty's policies for managing this vast empire's economy.
They had to deal with some pretty big challenges, right?
Yeah.
Keeping everyone fed, maintaining stability, preventing economic chaos.
No kidding. And they came up with some clever solutions. One was the equitable transportation system, or SHUS.
Equitable transportation. What does that even mean?
Basically, the government acted as a giant distributor. They collected surplus goods from regions where there was plenty and transported them to regions facing shortages. It helped stabilize prices, prevent famine, and ensure that everyone had access to essential goods.
Sounds like a pretty effective system. What other economic policies did they have up their sleeves?
They also implemented a price stabilization system, or O.
Price stabilization, so like keeping prices from fluctuating too wildly.
Exactly. The government would buy up goods when prices were low and sell them off when prices were high. It was an early attempt to manage inflation and create a more stable market.
Smart. But managing an empire isn't just about moving goods and money around. You also asked about how the Han Dynasty selected its officials, the people who actually ran the government.
They moved away from the Qin dynasty's strict legalist approach, which was all about meritocracy, selecting officials solely based on their abilities, regardless of their background.
So the Han took a different approach.
They did. They implemented a system called Zian, which blended meritocracy with a Confucian emphasis on character. Local officials would recommend talented individuals for government positions, but those candidates still had to prove themselves through examinations and interviews.
So it was a combination of what you know and who you know, but also what kind of person you are.
Exactly. They wanted competent officials, but they also wanted people who were morally upright and committed to the Confucian ideals of good governance.
Interesting. So they weren't just looking for brilliant minds, they were looking for people of character. Makes sense if you're trying to create a stable and harmonious society. But one last question before I move on to part 3. You asked if one philosophy ultimately won out during the Han Dynasty.
Well, during the reign of Emperor Wu, Confucianism was officially adopted as the state ideology.
So after all those competing schools of thought, Confucianism came out on top.
It did. It provided the ethical and philosophical framework for governing the Han Empire, and that had a huge impact on Chinese culture and society for centuries to come. But that's a story for next time.
Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient China. We're in the home stretch now, and you've saved some of the most intriguing questions for last. We've talked about powerful dynasties, influential philosophies, grand cities, but now it's time to zoom in on those everyday details that bring history to life. And of course, we can't forget about that world-changing invention you were all curious about.
It's like we're archaeologists sifting through the layers of time, finding those little pieces that connect us to the people who lived so long ago.
Exactly. So let's get granular.
Yeah.
You asked about a specific type of pottery found along the Yellow River, way back in 5000 to 4000 BCE painted pottery, or Heito. And it's more than just ancient dishes, right?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine these early farming communities not just struggling to survive, but expressing their creativity and beliefs through these beautiful pots. We see all sorts of intricate designs, geometric patterns, animal motifs, human figures.
I've seen pictures. They're so vibrant, so full of life. Makes you wonder what they meant to the people who made them.
Right. Were they purely decorative, or did they hold symbolic meaning? Maybe they were used in rituals or to tell stories. It's like trying to decode a visual language from thousands of years ago.
A visual language. I love
Yeah.
that. But like all things, pottery styles evolve. And you asked about another type found in the same region, but a bit later, around 2000 to 1500 BCE. This one's called black pottery, or Haitao. And it's got a totally different aesthetic.
Think sleek, minimalist, almost modern in its simplicity. It suggests that they were experimenting with new techniques, maybe higher firing temperatures to achieve that distinctive black finish. Or maybe tastes just changed.
Like a prehistoric trend toward understated elegance. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, people cared about design. Okay, enough pottery for now. Let's get back to those dynasties. You asked about the first dynasty in China that we have solid archaeological evidence for.
That would be the Shang dynasty, emerging around the 16th century BCE along the lower Yellow River Valley. This is where we move from the realm of myth and legend into a more historically grounded period. We've got excavated cities, royal tombs, bronze artifacts galore, and of course, those mysterious oracle bones.
The oracle bones. Yeah, we talked about them a bit before, but you specifically asked about the inscriptions on them, those cryptic messages from the past. What exactly are they, and what can they tell us?
Imagine you're the Shang king, and you're facing a tough decision, maybe whether to go to war or when to plant the crops or who to marry. You turn to your diviners, these sort of priest-scientists who inscribe your questions onto these bones or turtle shells.
It's like ancient magic 8-ball.
Kind of. Then they apply heat, causing the bones to crack, and they interpret these cracks as messages from the spirits or ancestors.
Wow, so it's a divination, but it also gave us the earliest known examples of Chinese writing. It's like a 2-for-1 deal. But like all dynasties, the Shang eventually came to an end. And you asked about the state that took over in the 11th century BCE, the Zhou dynasty. And they introduced this really important concept that shaped Chinese political thought for centuries. The mandate of heaven?
The mandate of heaven, it was revolutionary. It basically said that a ruler's right to rule came from heaven itself.
So not just from military power or inheritance.
Right. It was about being a morally just and effective ruler. If a king was righteous, heaven would grant him prosperity and stability for his people. But if he became corrupt or incompetent,
heaven could withdraw its mandate and he could be overthrown. No pressure. You were also curious about how the Zhou dynasty actually governed this vast territory. They implemented a system called Fujia, Fengjianzi, which is often translated as feudalism, but it worked a little differently in China than it did in, say, medieval Europe.
Think of it as a pyramid of loyalty and obligation. At the top is the king, who grants land to his nobles in exchange for their military service, loyalty, and taxes. Those nobles then grant portions of their land to lesser lords, and so on.
It's all about maintaining order and control through a network of personal relationships.
Exactly. But like any system based on human relationships, things can get messy.
And things definitely got messy in the 8th century BCE when something pretty dramatic happened. You asked about the sacking of the Zhou capital, Haojing?
It was a major turning point. Imagine the Zhou capital, sacked by invaders. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a symbolic blow to the dynasty's authority. The Zhou were forced to flee eastward and establish a new capital, marking a decline in their power and influence.
It's like that attack ripped a hole in the fabric of the empire. And this event ushered in a new era, the Spring and Autumn period, or Kunshi Shida, which lasted from 771 to 476 BCE. And its name comes from a pretty important text, right?
The Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of events, sort of like a historical record, of the state of Lu. And it's believed to have been compiled, or at least edited, by Confucius.
Confucius, he just keeps popping up everywhere. And you were curious about his role in this tumultuous period of Chinese history.
Well, Confucius, or Qin, wasn't just a philosopher. He was a social reformer who believed that society could be improved through moral cultivation. He emphasized ritual, or not just empty ceremonies, but the idea that every action, every interaction could be an opportunity to practice virtue.
So like a mindfulness practice, but for ancient China.
Exactly. It was about creating a society where everyone strives to be their best selves, both individually and in their relationships with others. And his other big idea was benevolence, or treating everyone with kindness, empathy, and respect.
It's amazing how relevant his ideas still are today. But Confucius wasn't the only voice in the philosophical choir. You asked about the era that followed the Spring and Autumn period, a time of even greater intellectual ferment and political upheaval, the Warring States period, or Zhangguoxiai.
The Warring States period lasted from 475 to 221 BCE, and it was a wild time. Constant warfare, shifting alliances, and in the midst of all this chaos, 100 schools of thought bloomed, all offering their own solutions to the problems of the day.
100 schools of thought. It must have been like a philosophical battle royale. And one of the most influential schools of thought was Confucianism, which we've talked about quite a bit.
Yeah.
But you asked specifically about a philosopher who took Confucius's ideas and ran with them, developing his own unique interpretation of human nature, Mencius, or Diane.
Mencius believed that humans are inherently good. He saw it like a seed that needs to be nurtured through education and self-cultivation.
So for Mencius, it's all about fostering our innate goodness. Like that. But of course, not everyone agreed. You asked about the philosopher who believed the exact opposite, that human nature is inherently bad.
That would be Sun Tzu, or Zhuangzi. He believed that we are born selfish and prone to wrongdoing, and it's society's job to mold us into moral beings through strict rules and rituals.
It's the age-old debate, nature versus nurture. But in ancient China, these weren't just abstract arguments. They had real-world implications for how society was structured and governed.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenging conventions, you asked about a philosopher who went against the Confucian grain, questioning those ideas of hierarchy and ritual. That was Mozi, or Mosner, the founder of Mohism.
Mozi. He was a fascinating figure. Tell us more about his ideas.
Imagine a world where love and compassion transcend all boundaries, where you care for a stranger as deeply as you care for your own family. That was Mozi's vision. He advocated for universal love, or Jinai, a radical concept in a society built on social hierarchy.
It's a beautiful idea, but definitely a challenging one to put into practice. And he also criticized those elaborate Confucian rituals, right? He saw them as wasteful and ultimately meaningless.
Exactly. He believed that true virtue lay in caring for the living, especially the poor and vulnerable, rather than obsessing over ceremonies for the dead. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. You asked about two philosophers who developed a school of thought that emphasized harmony with nature, living in accordance with the natural flow of the universe. Enter Taoism.
Taoism. It's all about going with the flow, right? But what does that actually mean?
Those philosophers were Laozi, or Ai, Zhuangzi, and Zhuangzi, or Zhuangzi. They believed in aligning oneself with the natural order of things, acting without striving or resisting. One of their key concepts was wu wei, or wu wei, which is often translated as non-action or effortless action.
Non-action. Sounds a bit passive.
It's not about being lazy or indifferent, though. It's more about recognizing that sometimes the best course of action is to, well, not act. It's about letting go of control, trusting the process, and finding harmony within the natural flow of the universe.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. It's about surrendering to the Tao, the way. But not every philosophy was so laid back. You asked about legalism, which takes a much more assertive approach to governing.
Legalism is all about order, control, and a strong state with clear laws and swift punishments. Its proponents, thinkers like Han Feizi and Shang Yang, believe that human nature is fundamentally selfish and that people need a strong ruler to keep them in line.
So no room for wu-wei in legalism?
Definitely not. They were all about practicality, efficiency, and maintaining order, even if it meant resorting to harsh measures. And this philosophy had a huge impact on the dynasty that ultimately unified China, the Qin dynasty. But we've already covered them in detail. Now let's talk about some of the individuals who shaped the Han dynasty. You asked about the historian who took on the Herculean task of documenting China's history, from mythical origins to the Han dynasty. Sima Qian, a brilliant scholar and storyteller. His work, The Records of the Grand Historian, or Tu, is considered a masterpiece of Chinese historiography. He didn't just chronicle events, he brought them to life, creating vivid portraits of emperors, generals, philosophers, and ordinary people who shaped China's past.
He sounds like a fascinating figure. But not every figure in the Han Dynasty was a scholar. You also asked about a rather ambitious and ultimately tragic figure who tried to shake things up.
You're talking about Wang Mang, the ambitious official who usurped the throne in 8 CE, interrupting the Han dynasty and establishing his own short-lived Jin dynasty. He was a reformer, an idealist, who envisioned a society based on ancient Confucian principles of social justice and equality.
He sounds like a man ahead of his time. What kind of reforms did he try to implement?
He enacted radical land reforms, attempted to abolish slavery, and nationalized key industries. But his changes were too much, too fast for the elites who benefited from the status quo. They resisted, and his policies ultimately backfired, leading to a series of rebellions that brought his dynasty down.
So the Han made a comeback. And after all that turmoil, I imagine they needed someone to document it all. You mentioned another historian who picked up where Sima Qian left off.
That would be Ban Gu, author of the Book of Han, or Yu, which became one of the official dynastic histories of China. Thanks to Sima Qian and Ban Gu, we have this incredible, detailed record of the Han dynasty, its triumphs and its failures, its heroes and its villains. But we can't wrap up our deep dive into ancient China without talking about that invention you were so curious about.
The one that changed the world. And it's something we use every day without even thinking about it.
During the Han Dynasty, Kailan refined and standardized the technique of papermaking. Before paper, writing was done on bulky bamboo strips, expensive silk, or cumbersome wooden tablets. Paper made writing more accessible, knowledge easier to spread, and ultimately revolutionized communication.
It's hard to imagine a world without paper. No books, no newspapers, no money as we know it. It's mind-boggling. And it's a testament to human ingenuity, that ability to take something as simple as plant fibers and transform them into a tool that would change the course of history.
And it's a reminder that even the most groundbreaking innovations often have humble beginnings. Papermaking didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the result of centuries of experimentation and refinement, with Kailan playing a key role in perfecting the process.
It's a great reminder that progress takes time, and it's often built on the work of those who came before us. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into ancient China. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired, energized, and a little bit overwhelmed by all the knowledge we've uncovered.
It's been quite a journey, from painted pottery to powerful empires, from philosophical debates to world-changing inventions. We've explored the incredible tapestry of ancient China, a civilization that continues to shape our world today.
And even though our deep dive is over, the exploration doesn't have to end here. There's always more to learn, more connections to make, and more stories to uncover. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, keep exploring the endlessly fascinating world of ancient China. Who knows what treasures you might find?